Fame is a strange and often misunderstood currency. The people who have it tend to think about it in terms of what it produces: access, income, influence, the opening of doors that remain closed to everyone else. The people who observe it from the outside tend to think about it in terms of what it costs: privacy, ordinariness, the freedom to be unremarkable in public without consequence. Both of these framings miss something essential. The most interesting thing about fame, the thing that reveals a person's character more clearly than almost any other circumstance, is what they choose to do with it when there is absolutely no practical reason to do anything at all, when the cameras are off, when the career implications are entirely neutral, when the only real question is whether the famous person in the room intends to use their position or simply to be human being inside it. In the autumn of 2009, Michael Bublé arrived at a small venue in a small city on what was supposed to be a straightforward tour stop. His team had the details. The venue had been confirmed. The technical requirements had been communicated well in advance. The tickets had been sold, every seat filled weeks earlier by people who had been looking forward to the evening with the particular anticipation that a Michael Bublé concert generated in its audience, the anticipation of warmth, of 2 hours that were reliably better than whatever had come before them. Everything was in order, in the way that the machinery of a major concert tour requires everything to be in order, because that machinery does not accommodate disorder gracefully, and the people who operate it have learned to eliminate variables wherever variables can be eliminated. What the machinery had failed to accommodate was a double booking. The venue, through a scheduling error that would later be traced to a miscommunication between two separate booking agents working with different calendar systems, had also committed the same date to a local amateur music collective called the Millbrook Sound, 7 musicians from the surrounding area who had been rehearsing together for 2 years, had never performed for a paying audience larger than their immediate families, and had spent 3 months preparing for what was, by every available measure, the most significant performance of their collective lives. Michael Bublé discovered the situation 2 hours before his scheduled showtime. He sat with it quietly, in the particular way he sat with problems, turning them over without drama until he understood their full dimensions. And then he made a decision that the venue manager, his tour manager, and every member of his production team would remember for years after the evening had ended. The venue was called the Carver Hall. It seated approximately 400 people in a converted warehouse space at the edge of a small city that had grown up around a now-defunct manufacturing industry and had been rebuilding its sense of itself, slowly and without particular fanfare, through the community institutions that small cities rely on for that purpose. The Carver Hall was not prestigious. It did not appear in the industry publications that documented the significant stops on significant tour. What it was to the people who lived in and around the city it served was something considerably more important than prestige. It was the room where things happened, where graduation ceremonies were held and benefit concerts were organized, and the local theater company mounted its annual production, and the amateur music nights drew the specific kind of audience that comes not because they have been told the performance will be excellent, but because they know the people on stage and want to be present for whatever is about to happen. The venue's manager was a woman named Patricia Oakes, who had worked at the Carver Hall for 11 years and had developed through that tenure an intimate understanding of what the hall could hold and what it could not. She had been delighted by the Bublé booking. It was the highest profile act the venue had ever hosted, and had been managing its logistics with the organized intensity of someone given an extraordinary responsibility and determined to prove equal to it. She had agreed months earlier to give the Millbrook Sound the secondary performance space adjacent to the main hall on a night when the main hall was occupied by a touring act, on the understanding that the arrangement would work because the two audiences were entirely separate and the performances would not overlap in any logistically problematic way. The arrangement had worked in theory until the touring act turned out to be Michael Bublé and his full production team, whose technical requirements for the main hall, the sound system specifications, the monitor configurations, the stage setup, created acoustic conditions that would bleed into the secondary space in ways that made any simultaneous performance there impossible. Patricia had discovered this 3 weeks before the show and had spent those 3 weeks trying to find a solution that did not require telling either party about the other's existence, a strategy that collapsed completely when Michael's tour manager arrived that afternoon for the technical walkthrough, and the full picture of the double booking became unavoidable. The Millbrook Sound had been formed 2 years earlier by 7 musicians who lived within a 30-kilometer radius of each other, and had found their way together through the combination of local open mic nights, a community music program at the regional library, and the specific social gravity that draws people who play instruments toward each other in places where such people are not particularly common. Their de facto leader was Henry Moss, a retired schoolteacher of 54 who played piano and had recently begun writing his own material after 3 decades of performing other people's songs in a church choir. Henry had the particular quality of some retired teachers, an unshakable composure in the face of difficulty and a precise instinct for the difference between what people said and what they meant. There was Sandra Reilly, whose voice her friends described consistently as something the radio had simply failed to discover, warm and accurate, the kind of instrument that sounds inevitable rather than effortful. There was Abby Winters, 19 years old and the group's youngest member, who played fiddle with a technical precision that exceeded her years and a feeling for the music that exceeded her technique. There were 2 brothers, Marcus and David Cho, who played guitar and bass with the easy, wordless coordination of siblings who have been playing together since childhood, their communication entirely nonverbal, entirely reliable. And there was Paul Chen, who sang harmonies with an instinctive accuracy he had never formally studied and did not fully understand, which was perhaps why it worked as well as it did. They had booked the Carver Hall's secondary space through a conversation between Henry Moss and Patricia Oakes, who had offered them the space as part of the hall's commitment to supporting local musicians. They had been preparing their set for 3 months, the most serious 3 months of rehearsal any of them had undertaken, driven by the knowledge that performing for a real audience in a real venue was a different proposition from playing for each other in Henry's living room, and that the difference required preparation proportional to its significance. They had set up their equipment in the secondary space that afternoon and were in the green room, the 7 of them around a table with coffee and set lists, and the particular charged quietness of people 2 hours from the most important thing they had ever done. When Patricia Oakes came in and told them it was no longer possible, Henry listened to the explanation with the steadiness of a man who has delivered and received difficult news professionally for decades. He asked the practical questions without alarm. Patricia answered them honestly. The picture that emerged was clear. The technical situation made simultaneous performance impossible, and Michael Bublé's booking had the prior contractual claim. Henry thanked Patricia for her directness, returned to the green room, and told his 6 fellow musicians what had happened. Sandra Reilly cried quietly, not with the drama of someone performing distress, but with the genuine, contained tears of someone absorbing a disappointment that is larger than she had words for. Abby Winters went very still. The Cho brothers exchanged a look that carried everything siblings can communicate without language. Paul Chen looked at the floor. And then 50 minutes later there was a knock on the green room door. Before any decision was made, before the tour manager had been given instructions, before any of the administrative resolution of the double booking had been attempted, Michael Bublé had gone to listen. He had heard about the Millbrook Sound from Patricia Oakes' explanation to his tour manager and had asked simply whether they were still rehearsing. They were. He walked to the secondary performance space, arrived before any introduction could be arranged, and stood in the doorway listening for 20 minutes while Henry Moss ran the group through their set without anyone in the room knowing he was there. What he heard was not polished in the professional sense. The arrangements carried the specific quality of music, built from feeling rather than training, direct and personal, with the kind of occasional roughness that, in the right context, reads not as inadequacy but as honesty. Sandra Reilly's voice was precisely what he had been told it was, a genuine instrument carrying a melody with the inevitability that only comes when the singer is not reaching for the emotion but simply reporting it. Henry Moss's song, a piece about the view from the hill behind his house in the early morning, when the light arrived at an angle that made the ordinary landscape briefly extraordinary, had the quality of something written because it needed to be written, not because someone had decided a song was required. When his tour manager appeared at his shoulder and said quietly that a decision needed to be made about the evening's logistics, Michael said, "I've already made it." His tour manager asked what it was. Michael said, "They perform tonight, in the main hall, for our audience." His tour manager was quiet for a moment, the silence of someone processing information that is outside the range of the scenarios they had prepared for. Then he said, "And you?" Michael said, "I'll open for them." His tour manager looked at him. Michael said, "The audience came to hear music. They'll hear mine first, and then they'll hear something they didn't know they needed." That's usually the most valuable part of any evening. Michael knocked on the greenroom door himself. Henry Moss opened it and found himself looking at a face he recognized from record covers, standing in the corridor of the Carver Hall without announcement or ceremony, in the specific unannounced way of someone who has something to say and is not interested in having it prepared for. Michael introduced himself, which was more courtesy than necessity. Henry said, "I know who you are." Michael said, "I heard you rehearse just now. I came to tell you that you're performing tonight in the main hall after my set." He said it without preamble, without the softening constructions that people use when they are uncertain about the reception of what they are about to say. He said it the way people say things when they have decided them fully and are simply communicating a decision that has already been made. Henry looked at him for a long moment with the assessing steadiness of someone who has been evaluating sincerity for 30 years in classrooms full of teenagers who are frequently trying to present something other than the truth. What he saw in Michael Bublé's expression was the complete absence of performance, no visible generosity, no curated warmth, no awareness of how the offer was being received, simply a man communicating a plan that seemed to him obvious and correct. The absence of performance was, paradoxically, the most convincing thing Henry had encountered in recent memory. He said, "Give me a moment with my people." He closed the door. He sat back down at the table and looked at his 6 fellow musicians. He told them what had been offered. He told them what he had seen in the face of the person offering it. Sandra Reilly, who had been crying 20 minutes earlier, went very still. Paul Chen looked up from the floor with an expression that had not been there before. The Cho brothers said nothing for a moment, and then Marcus, the older one, said, "Are you serious?" Henry said, "Completely." Abby Winters, 19 years old, the youngest person in the room, the one with the most years of music ahead of her and the least experience of what the world occasionally offered, said, "Then we should tune up." And that was entirely the end of the discussion. Michael's 45 minutes were extraordinary in the particular way that performances become extraordinary when the performer has been given a reason to care that exceeds the ordinary ones. He was not performing only for the audience in front of him, he was creating a room, preparing a space, warming 400 people to the specific emotional temperature at which they would be ready to receive something they had not known was coming and had not paid for and would not, he understood, forget easily once it arrived. He did this without telling them what was coming, without managing their expectations or framing the gift in advance. He simply sang with the warmth and technical precision that had made him one of the most beloved live performers of his generation, and paid close attention to the room as it opened. When he finished his set, he stood at the microphone for a moment before speaking. Then he said, "I want to share this stage tonight with some musicians from this part of the world who have been preparing something for you for 3 months. I heard them rehearse earlier today, and I can tell you that what you are about to hear is worth your time. Please welcome the Millbrook Sound." He stepped back from the microphone and began to applaud, and the 400 people in the Carver Hall, following the lead of the man who had just given them 45 minutes of music they had come specifically to receive, applauded with him for 7 musicians they had never heard of. Henry Moss walked onto the stage first. He sat at the piano and looked out at 400 people, the largest audience he had performed for in his life, by a factor of roughly 40, with the composed steadiness of a man who has faced rooms full of restless teenagers for 30 years and has developed through that experience an immunity to the fear that comes from being looked at by a large number of people simultaneously. He played the opening chord. Sandra Reilly walked to the microphone. Abby Winters raised her fiddle. Marcus and David Cho took their positions. Paul Chen adjusted his monitor level, and the Millbrook Sound began to play. The performance was not flawless. There were moments of the specific roughness that amateur performances carry, a transition that hesitated slightly, a harmony that arrived a fraction late, the audible collective breath of 7 people quietly confirming their position in the arrangement. These imperfections were not incidental to the experience. They were part of its meaning. They told the 400 people in the Carver Hall something that polished performances cannot tell, that what was happening on the stage was being made in the room rather than reproduced from a prior construction, that it was contingent in the way that genuinely lived things are contingent, that the people making it were doing so in real time with everything they had, which was different in kind from the virtuosity that money and years of professional training could produce. Sandra Reilly sang Henry's song about the view from the hill. The 400 people listened with the particular quality of attention that audiences produce when something genuine is happening that they do not entirely have the framework to process. They were quiet in the specific way of people who are receiving something rather than consuming it, a quality of stillness that is distinct from the stillness of boredom and from the engaged restlessness of an audience waiting for the next expected thing. Michael stood in the wings and watched from the dark. He watched Sandra sing and thought what he sometimes thought when he heard a voice that deserved more room than it had been given, that the world's systems for finding and elevating real things were, as a general matter, poorly designed. When the Millbrook Sound finished their final song, the silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the 400 people in the Carver Hall rose, not the reflexive, automatic rising of a crowd following a social script, but the genuine and spontaneous standing of people who have just received something they did not expect and are responding with the only physical language available to them when words are insufficient. Henry Moss sat at the piano and looked at the standing room with an expression that was beyond surprise and beyond gratitude, and somewhere in the territory of things that happen to a person once, perhaps, if they are fortunate, and that they spend the rest of their lives understanding they were present for. Abby Winters burst into tears, not the quiet, contained tears of someone managing distress, but the full, ungoverned tears of a 19-year-old who has just experienced something larger than the largest version of it she had permitted herself to imagine. Sandra Reilly put her arm around her. The Cho brothers looked at each other, and Marcus said something quietly that nobody else heard. Paul Chen bowed his head. Henry remained at the piano, both hands resting on the keys, simply present in the room while 400 people told him, at length and on their feet, what they thought of what he had made. Michael Bublé did not return to the stage for the standing ovation. It belonged to the Millbrook Sound entirely, and walking back onto the stage they were standing on would have been a reclamation of something he had genuinely given away. He watched from the wings, in the dark at the edge of the frame, as 7 musicians from a small place received something they had spent 2 years and 3 months of serious preparation earning. Michael did not tell this story to the press. He did not include it in the carefully maintained narrative of his public persona. He did not mention the Millbrook Sound in subsequent interviews or use the evening as evidence of his character in the way that public figures sometimes deploy private acts of generosity once those acts have become known. The evening at the Carver Hall was not publicly known because nobody had covered it. The local newspaper's photographer had left before the Millbrook Sound took the stage, and the broader music press had not been present at a mid-tour stop in a 400-seat venue on a Tuesday evening in a small city. The 400 people who were there told the people who had not been, with the specific energy of witnesses to something they understood was unusual. The story moved through the city the way stories move in small places, thoroughly, without speed, reaching eventually everyone who needed to receive it. Henry Moss sent a letter to Michael's management company 6 weeks after the evening. He wrote, among other things, "You gave 7 people from a small place the experience of being heard by a large room. I do not know if you understand. That means to people who have spent most of their lives making music for rooms where the audience already knows them. It means that the music was real. It means that what we heard in ourselves when we played was not vanity or wishful thinking, but something that deserved the space you gave it. That is not a small gift. It is one of the largest gifts that one musician can give another, and it was given without being asked for, which is the form in which the largest gifts almost always arrive. He signed it Henry Moss, the Millbrook Sound. He received a handwritten reply 6 weeks later. It said, "The room was ready for you. I just made sure it was open. Thank you for being prepared for it." It was signed simply, "Michael, fame at its best is not a possession. It is a condition that makes certain things possible: access, attention, the opening of rooms that remain closed to everyone else." What a person does with those open rooms is the question that character answers, repeatedly, across the years of a career long enough to reveal who they are beneath the circumstances that shape them. Michael Bublé spent an autumn evening in 2009 opening a room that 400 people were already in and inviting 7 musicians who had never performed for a paying audience of that size to walk into it. He did not do this to be seen doing it. He did not do it because anyone had asked. He did it because he had listened to a rehearsal through a doorway and heard something real, and the part of him built by his grandfather's records and the years in empty bars and the long, patient conviction that music mattered understood, without requiring deliberation, that real things deserved to be heard by people who were present and ready to receive them. The Carver Hall still stands. Patricia Oakes managed it for 8 more years before handing the position to her assistant. The secondary performance space where the Millbrook Sound had set up their equipment that afternoon has since been converted to additional storage. But on the wall of the main hall, among the framed photographs documenting the performances the venue has hosted across its years, there is one image from the autumn of 2009 showing 7 musicians taking a bow in front of a standing room. None of the 7 faces in the image is famous. The stage belongs to all of them completely. And somewhere in the wings, in the dark at the very edge of the frame, there is the barely visible figure of a man who made sure the room was open and then stepped back so they could walk into it. That is all he did. That was everything.